Well, I was born in Shelley, Idaho in 1949. My training was in medical oncology. I was a medical oncologist and came back to the University of Utah and to the VA hospital as the chief of medical oncology at the VA hospital. We had heard, I had also been a veteran, so I was a veteran in Long Beach, California, and I was at the VA hospital in Palo Alto, California for 4 years between 1980 and 1984. So we had heard a little bit about Downwinders and Downwinder studies in my fellowship, but when I came back to the University of Utah as the chief of oncology at the VA, was really the first time that we started to see some of the veterans who were coming back with cancers, early cancers, unusual cancers, and while there was no real program that I recall that would say identify these people as or do anything special to them in terms of Downwinders, it was some of the patients who said, you know, I lived in southern Utah, I was born and raised in southern Utah, and I've heard about the Downwinders program, but I need to have verification that I have cancer, so can you help us with that? And that was really my first introduction to the Downwinders program. We saw most of the typical cancers that occur in the veteran population. A lot of them were smokers, so we saw a lot of lung cancer. And we saw a lot of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, we saw a lot of colon cancer. And even now, we really do not know what exposure to radiation, what percentage of any cancer is related to radiation. Back then, the fact that they would include lung cancer as one of the diseases that was included as part of the compensation program was a little bit strange to me because these people had all smoked, and smoking was a clear cause of cancer. And so while it may have contributed to their cancer, they also had another very major factor that was probably contributing as well, which was cigarette smoking. CLL is a cancer that's probably one of the most common cancers in older folks. And CLL was one that was denied, and I had particular problems with that. But initially they said, well, okay, it's going to be lymphoma, and then it's going to be lung cancer, and then it's going to be things. But in looking at the list recently, it's pretty much any other cancer other than CLL, which I think is probably short-sighted, but also saved the government a lot of money because CLL is quite common, and my own belief is that CLL should have been included on the list because I think it was one of the things that we saw more commonly with CLL in that group. My father was initially a farmer and then had training as a machinist. And many of the families in southern Idaho were affected by the Idaho Nuclear Laboratory, which it was the AEC and then the INEL. It's had various iterations through the years. It's now the INL. But my father worked for the Atomic Energy Commission for 20 years, and he would wear a badge. And growing up, I remember he would come home wearing a badge, and there would be days that he would not be allowed to go back to work because his badge numbers were too high. Now, as a kid growing up, I had no idea what that meant. But he would not be allowed to go back to work because his numbers were too high. So I never understood what work he did. He was a machinist, but I'm assuming that he was around radiation, obviously, because of that. Not directly related to the atomic above-ground testing in Nevada, but as part of the program in Idaho, he and the family, subsequently after his death, he died of multiple myeloma. And after his death, the family has been compensated because of his exposure to radiation. Now, that again is not directly related to the Downwinders, but it's part of the overall nuclear program for the United States. Growing up in Idaho, we heard a little bit about the above-ground testing that was going on in Nevada. I was very young at the time, so I left when I was 18. But I was there during the testing, and having seen the Stephen Miller maps of the clouds that went over probably the United States, I'm sure that we were exposed to iodine and other things growing up in Idaho. We drank fresh cow's milk. We had dairy farms. We had never saw dust clouds, but I'm sure we were exposed to radiation. I had a strange situation. I had a younger brother who died at age 39, and he had smoked for 10 years, and so the normal exposure time that we think about when people get cancer or lung cancer is a 20-pack year history. So that's a pack a day for 20 years or 2 packs a day for 10 years. So he smoked less than a pack a day for 10 years. And he died at a very young age of lung cancer. It was lung cancer related to cigarette smoking that is typically related to cigarette smoking, but his case was quite unusual. And he would have been living in both southern Idaho and parts of Utah during the Downwinders. He was born in 1941, I believe, and so he would have been exposed as well. Can't put those together. He was never a veteran. He's never directly exposed otherwise, but you'd have to say there was perhaps a contribution there. I think the biggest concern back then was the concern about the Soviet Union and the fact that we might be affected by nuclear fallout from an atomic bomb. And so there was discussion back then about nuclear fallout shelters and having your own shelter. And clearly at that time there was no way, very poor farm family, there was no way that any of those people were going to have their own fallout shelters or anything else that would protect them. So there was always that concern that we were going to be exposed to fallout from an atomic explosion related to the Russians. Didn't really think very much, or don't remember very much discussion about our own program. Looking at things retrospectively, it's always easier. I understand the threat that we thought we were under from the Japanese and from Germans, and the necessity to build something that would stop the war. In retrospect, the fact that we used nuclear weapons on another country makes me sad. The fact that we exposed our own citizens and our own military, quite honestly, unnecessarily, also makes me sad. I think that was very inappropriate. I think the people who were developing it, Fermi and Teller and whoever else was developing our nuclear program, had to know and should have known that there was going to be risks from that exposure. And I think that should have been taken into consideration, and certainly innocent civilians should not have been exposed, and certainly the poor veterans, the military, making them go in and view the above ground testing, making them clean up afterwards, making them wear badges. They knew that this was not going to be safe for them. This was developed as a way to kill people, and it certainly did. And I think our government is at fault for not taking more steps to try and prevent people from being exposed. I've had several friends growing up, and people in the area that I grew up in who have had, cancers that just were a little bit unusual. Unusual in terms of what age they developed them, or that they would develop them because they were more typical for smokers or people who had other exposures. So it's been that, and also in Utah. And in my experience of knowing people in Utah and taking care of people in Utah. So I think the real extent of the downwinders and of the downwinder effect, that is being exposed to excessive levels of radiation, I think is really unknown and underestimated probably. I see that the compensation program is scheduled to stop in 2022. I'm going to do what I can to see that doesn't happen. And I'm going to try and see if anything is being done now at the VA to try to identify these people, because there are still people out there who were downwinders. I mean, I'm 70 now, but there's still some veterans who are older and or families of these guys who should be compensated. And so I'm going to see if there isn't something we can do to try to either extend that or to make sure that people are identified, because I think there's some people who could use that compensation.